South Carolina, 1838. They used to whisper about the girl who never cried. Not when the overseer's boot stopped beside her. Not when names were spoken that should never be said aloud. Not even when she learned the truth that changed how she counted her days. She was small for her age, quiet in a way that unsettled grown people, with eyes that watched more than they pleaded. The others thought her numb, or broken early by the world she had been born into. But silence was not emptiness. It was a shelter she built for herself, plank by careful plank, listening, remembering, waiting. And when the truth finally reached her, soft as dust settling on a window ledge, she did not cry. She learned how to survive it. In South Carolina, 1838, the girl was known first by what she did not do. She did not cry. Not when the horn sounded before dawn, and sleep was pulled from her like a blanket in winter. Not when a sharp voice called her from across the yard, using a tone that carried warning even before the words arrived. The absence of tears unsettled people more than screaming ever could. Crying was expected. Crying made sense to those who believed suffering had a proper sound. Silence, however, suggested something unfinished. She was young, no more than 12, by the careful count of the older women, who marked years by harvests and births rather than calendars. Her frame was narrow, her movements economical. She did not rush unless ordered to, and even then her steps were measured, as if she were always counting the distance between herself and danger. When spoken to, she lifted her eyes only as much as required, long enough to show she was listening, not long enough to invite inspection. What set her apart was not a lack of feeling, but a different use of it. Where others reacted, she recorded. She noticed which overseer cleared his throat before delivering bad news, and which one avoided eye contact afterward. She learned that the mistress's footsteps sounded lighter when company was expected and heavier when disappointment followed her down the hall. She knew which boards on the porch creaked and which did not, and she adjusted her path accordingly. These were not tricks taught to her. They were conclusions drawn slowly, over years of watching without being seen watching. The adults around her mistook this stillness for dullness. A child who did not cry was assumed not to care or not to understand. That misunderstanding gave her a thin but valuable covering. She was spoken about as if she were furniture, present, useful, but incapable of thought. Conversations drifted over her head in half voices, comments trailing off only when someone remembered her and waved a hand, saying, "She don't know nothing." The girl learned early that people were careless when they believed themselves unobserved. Among the enslaved, her quiet earned a different response. Some found it troubling. A child who did not cry was a child who carried sorrow inward, and inward sorrow could break a person without warning. Others, especially the older women, watched her with a knowing patience. They had seen children like her before. Not many, but enough to recognize the signs. These were the ones who survived by remembering rather than resisting openly, by storing truth instead of demanding it. The girl worked where she was placed, her hands learning tasks quickly, her mind drifting elsewhere, while her body moved through familiar motions. Shelling peas, sweeping hearth ash, carrying water. Each chore became an opportunity to listen. She learned how voices changed when authority entered a room. She learned which words were spoken only behind closed doors. She noticed that her name was sometimes said softly, and sometimes avoided altogether, replaced with a gesture or a nod. That absence lodged in her thoughts like a pebble in a shoe, small but impossible to ignore. When punishment came, as it did for everyone sooner or later, she did not cry then either. She bit the inside of her cheek and focused on counting. Fence posts, heartbeats, anything that could be ordered. The lack of tears did not lessen the pain, but it changed how others perceived it. Some took her silence as proof she was hardened. Others grew uneasy, unsure whether she felt anything at all. That uncertainty worked quietly in her favor. People were less eager to test what they could not read. At night, when the quarters settled into uneasy rest, she replayed the day in her mind. Not the labor. That faded quickly, but the moments between words. A look exchanged. A sentence cut short. A name spoken when it should not have been. She assembled these fragments carefully, like pieces of a broken plate, never forcing them together before their time. She did not yet know what picture they would form. She only knew they mattered. The girl understood, even at her age, that reacting openly carried risk. Tears invited questions. Questions invited attention. Attention could be dangerous in ways that were not always immediate. Silence, on the other hand, could be mistaken for ignorance, and ignorance was underestimated. Underestimation allowed space. In that space, she learned. She watched how people behaved when they thought they were kind. She watched how kindness changed when it was no longer convenient. She learned that promises were often shaped like favors, and favors like chains. These lessons did not make her bitter. They made her careful. Careful enough to know that crying might give relief, but silence gave time. By the time others began to whisper about her, the quiet one, the strange one, she had already built a private understanding of the world she lived in. Not the world as it was described in sermons or rules, but the world as it operated through habit, fear, and unspoken agreements. She understood that survival did not always belong to the loudest or the strongest. Sometimes it belonged to those who watched, waited, and remembered. This was the foundation of who she was becoming. Before the truth reached her ears, before names and bloodlines complicated her place in the world, she was already learning the hardest lesson of all. That endurance was not passive. It was active, disciplined, and often invisible. And in South Carolina, 1838, that kind of endurance could mean the difference between being erased and being remembered, even if only by oneself. In South Carolina, 1838, knowledge rarely arrived as a clear announcement. It came in pieces, carried on breath and carelessness, offered unintentionally to those considered too small or too unimportant to understand it. For the girl who did not cry, the first crack in her understanding of herself came not from a question she asked, but from a name she was never meant to hear spoken aloud. It happened on an afternoon shaped like many others. The heat sat low and heavy over the yard, pressing the air flat. She had been sent to the side of the main house with a basket of clean linens, her task to leave them just inside the back door and return without delay. The girl moved as she always did, quietly, without drawing attention. Her eyes lowered, her steps careful on the worn boards. She paused only because voices drifted toward her from the parlor, sharper than the slow hum of summer insects. The door was not fully closed. It rarely was. White voices carried an easy confidence, shaped by the belief that nothing said inside those walls could trouble the lives outside them. At first, she listened without meaning to. Tone reached her before words. One voice was tense, clipped, carrying frustration poorly disguised as concern. Another was smoother, practiced, the sound of someone accustomed to being agreed with. She recognized both. They were not speaking to her, and so they forgot her. Then she heard her name. Not the shortened form used in the yard. Not the one barked when work lagged or spoken quickly when a task was finished. It was her full name, said carefully, as though it required handling. The sound of it stopped her breath mid-step. Names mattered. She had learned that much early. A name spoken whole carried weight. She remained still, the basket balanced against her hip, her body angled just enough to suggest movement, had merely paused. Inside the room, the voices continued. She's old enough now, one said. Old enough for what? Came the reply. To start noticing. and that could become a problem. The girl did not know what problem meant in this context, but she understood its shape. It was not the kind that could be solved with work or obedience. It was the kind that lingered. The voices lowered, but not enough. She caught fragments rather than sentences. Words like favor arrangement and best left alone. Her name surfaced again, followed by silence. The kind of silence that suggested agreement had been reached without being spoken plainly. Her first instinct was not fear, but confusion. She had been spoken of before, often without courtesy, but never with such care. Never as though she were something that required planning. The careful way her name had been said unsettled her more than anger would have. She did not stay to listen longer. She had learned when listening became dangerous. She placed the basket where she had been told, then moved away at the same pace she had arrived. No one called after her. No one noticed her departure. The world did not change in any visible way, and yet something had shifted. That evening, as the quarters settled and conversation turned low, the girl sat apart, her thoughts circling the sound of her name. She tested it silently, repeating it in her mind as it had been spoken. Slowly, deliberately. She noticed how it differed from the way others said it. She wondered why. Over the following days, small details began to arrange themselves differently. She noticed that certain instructions were delivered indirectly, passed through others rather than given to her directly. She noticed that when she was reprimanded, the words were sharp but brief, as though the speaker wished the moment over quickly. She noticed that the mistress, who rarely looked twice at her, sometimes paused now, her gaze lingering before moving on. None of this was dramatic. There were no sudden changes in her labor or her place. That was what made it more troubling. The attention came in half measures, in hesitations that suggested restraint rather than concern. The girl did not ask about what she had heard. Questions, she understood, could lead to answers that were not meant for her safety. Instead, she watched more closely. She listened for her name. She learned who used it and who avoided it. She learned that some people could speak it only when they believed no one else was listening. Once, passing near the house again, she heard her name spoken with irritation, followed by the words, "It complicates things." Another time, it was spoken softly, almost regretfully, paired with a sigh. These tones did not match the life she lived. They belonged to decisions made elsewhere. Slowly, she began to understand that her name carried a story she had not been told. That story moved around her like a current beneath still water. She could not see it fully, but she could feel its pull. The knowledge did not make her cry. It settled into her the way heat settles into the earth. Gradually, inevitably, she understood that knowing something without understanding it fully could be dangerous. But not knowing at all was worse. So she chose the path she had always chosen. She observed. She remembered. The name became an anchor in her mind, a point she returned to whenever something did not make sense. Why she was sometimes spared harsh words others received. Why certain eyes followed her with discomfort rather than indifference. Why silence surrounded her in moments when others were openly discussed. By overhearing her name spoken as something that required management, the girl crossed a quiet threshold. She was no longer just a child moving through the routines of the plantation. She had become, in the minds of others, a complication. And complications, she sensed, were rarely allowed to exist without consequence. Yet she did not panic. She did not reveal what she had heard. She carried the knowledge the way she carried water. Carefully, without spilling, understanding that its value lay not in display, but in preservation. In South Carolina, 1838, that was how truth survived long enough to matter. In South Carolina, 1838, wisdom did not announce itself with authority. It moved quietly, carried in glances and pauses between words, in the careful way a task was demonstrated rather than explained. For the girl who never cried, understanding deepened not through direct instruction, but through the steady presence of the elder women who had learned, through long years, what could be said and what must remain unspoken. They noticed her long before they spoke to her. The elders always did. They watched how she worked without complaint, how she listened more than she spoke, how her eyes lingered on people rather than objects. They had seen children like her before, children whose silence was not emptiness but storage. These were the ones who survived by remembering. At first, their guidance came disguised as correction. An older woman would shift her grip on a tool and say, "Not that way," moving the girl's hands gently, but firmly into a position that saved effort and avoided attention. Another would murmur, "Slow down," not because the work required it, but because haste invited scrutiny. These lessons were practical, but their meaning went deeper. They were instructions on how to exist without attracting harm. The girl accepted these corrections without question. She understood instinctively that instruction offered in this manner was rare and valuable. The elders did not waste words. When they spoke, it was because speaking mattered. Over time, the lessons became more deliberate. While shelling peas or mending cloth, one woman would speak softly, her voice low enough to blend with the sounds of work. "Listen more than you look," she said once without lifting her eyes. People mind their faces. They forget their tongues. The girl stored the phrase carefully, repeating it in her mind until it became habit. Another lesson came in the form of stories. Not grand tales, but recollections offered without drama. An elder spoke of a girl who had repeated something she overheard, thinking truth would protect her. It had not. The story ended without explanation. The conclusion understood rather than stated. Silence filled the space where questions might have been asked. The girl did not ask. The elder women recognized the change in her after the overheard name, though she never spoke of it. They had learned to read such shifts. A child who listened differently, who weighed words before responding, was carrying something heavy. Instead of pressing her, they adjusted their guidance. They taught her how to remember without writing. One woman showed her how to tie knots in thread, each knot marking something important. A person, a promise, a warning. Another taught her to associate information with tasks, linking memory to movement so it could not be taken away. "They can't steal what they don't know you have," she said once, her voice steady, her hands never still. They taught her patience as a skill, not a burden. When the girl grew restless, one elder said, "Waiting ain't doing nothing. It's choosing not to do the wrong thing too soon." The words stayed with her. They reframed stillness as action. The elders also taught her about tone. Not what to say, but how to say it if speech became necessary. A question asked softly could pass unnoticed. A statement offered as confusion rather than certainty could avoid punishment. These were not tricks meant for advantage, but shields meant for survival. Most importantly, they taught her how to be overlooked without being erased. One woman explained it indirectly, by example. She moved through the day efficiently, never the fastest, never the slowest. She accepted instructions without argument and finished tasks without flourish. "You want to be the one they forget to count," she said quietly, as if speaking of something as simple as numbers. The girl understood. In the evenings, when work eased and the air cooled, the elders sometimes sang low hymns or spoke in murmurs that blended memory with caution. The girl listened, learning the rhythm of coded speech. How sorrow could be expressed without naming its cause. How hope could exist without promising relief. She learned that endurance did not always sound like strength. Sometimes it sounded like breathing. Through these women, the girl learned to trust her own observations. When she hesitated, Unsure whether what she noticed mattered, an elder would nod slightly, as if to say it did. This quiet validation shaped her confidence more than praise ever could. She learned that seeing clearly was a form of resistance, even when no action followed immediately. The elders never spoke of freedom directly. Such talk carried danger. Instead, they spoke of staying alive, of keeping one's mind intact, of remembering names and stories so they would not vanish. In doing so, they offered the girl a lineage not defined by blood, but by knowledge. By the time she understood the full weight of what she carried, she was no longer alone with it. The lessons from the elder women had given her structure, ways to hold truth without letting it destroy her. They had taught her that silence could be shared, and that wisdom, when passed carefully, could outlast cruelty. In South Carolina, 1838, these lessons were not written down. They lived in hands and glances, in the quiet shaping of a child who never cried. Not because she felt nothing, but because she was learning how to endure everything. In South Carolina, 1838, truths were rarely delivered whole. They emerged slowly, like outlines seen through fog, shaped more by what was avoided than by what was spoken. The girl who never cried did not learn who she was through a confession or a revelation meant for her ears. She learned the way most dangerous truths were learned, by assembling fragments others believed harmless on their own. By this time, she had grown accustomed to carrying questions without voicing them. The overheard use of her name had not faded from her mind. Instead, it had sharpened her attention. She noticed how certain people adjusted themselves around her, how a sentence would change direction once she entered a space. She noticed that the overseer, harsh with most, corrected her with restraint. His displeasure expressed more through silence than anger. None of this made sense on its own. Together, it formed a pattern. The confirmation came in pieces, spread across weeks. One afternoon, she was sent inside the main house to hold a door while furniture was moved. She stood where she was placed, eyes lowered, hands folded, listening to the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Two women spoke nearby, their voices wary, unguarded by routine. One said, "It would have been simpler if she favored the mother more." The other replied, "She does, if you look closely." But the eyes, those came from elsewhere. The girl did not know what elsewhere meant in that moment, but she understood what it was not. It was not the quarters. It was not spoken with distance. It carried weight and something like discomfort. Another fragment arrived days later, while she was fetching water near the house. The mistress spoke to a visiting relative, her voice tight. "She's not like the others," she said. "That's what makes it difficult." The relative laughed uneasily. Then she should have been thought of earlier. The laughter stopped quickly, replaced by a silence that told the girl more than words could. Still, no one spoke directly to her. No one named what was being avoided. But the elders noticed her growing stillness, the way her listening deepened. One evening, while passing her a piece of bread, an older woman paused longer than usual. "Some truths don't need saying," she murmured. "You'll know them by how people behave around you." The girl understood then that she was nearing something final. The clearest piece came not from white voices, but from an elder who had lived long enough to recognize the signs. They were alone, sorting cloth. The elder did not look at her when she spoke. "You ever wonder why you don't get sent where others do?" she asked quietly. The girl did not answer. "Or why they mind their tempers with you, even when they shouldn't?" Still silence. The elder sighed. "It don't change what you are," she said carefully. "But it explains why some folks act like they owe something they can't pay." That was the closest anyone came to saying it outright. The girl did not need more. The fragments settled into place, heavy but unmistakable. She understood that her father was not among the enslaved, that her existence was tied to decisions made without consent, and to consequences that were still being managed years later. She understood why her name was handled with care, why her presence complicated conversations meant to be simple. The knowledge did not arrive with anger. It arrived with clarity. She felt no sudden need to cry. Tears would not undo what had already shaped her life. Instead, she felt a tightening inside her chest. Not pain exactly, but resolve. The truth explained the unevenness of her treatment, the quiet restraint that followed her like a shadow. It explained why she was watched not just as property, but as reminder. She also understood what the truth did not give her. It did not give her protection she could rely on. It did not offer a path out of bondage. It was not a secret that could be used openly. It was dangerous knowledge, useful only if carried carefully. The elders did not press her afterward. They saw the change in her posture, the steadiness that replaced uncertainty. One nodded at her once, a simple acknowledgement. No comfort was offered. Comfort could soften vigilance. Instead, they offered inclusion, drawing her closer during work, speaking to her in ways that assumed understanding rather than explaining it. The girl began to see herself differently, not as separate, but as watched. Her existence was evidence of something others wished forgotten. That made her presence risky, not because of anything she did, but because of what she represented. She learned then that identity could be a burden placed on a person without their choosing. She adjusted accordingly. She became even more careful with her silence. She chose invisibility when possible, neutrality when necessary. She learned when to step forward and when to remain still. The truth did not make her reckless. It made her precise. At night, she thought about her mother, not in anger, but with a quiet sorrow she kept to herself. She understood now why certain things had never been spoken, why love had sometimes come wrapped in warning rather than warmth. She did not judge. Judgment required distance. She had none. The discovery of her parentage did not free her, but it sharpened her understanding of the world she lived in. She now knew that her life was shaped by more than labor and obedience. It was shaped by secrets that belonged to others but lived inside her. In South Carolina, 1838, that knowledge could destroy a person if carried carelessly. But the girl who never cried had already learned how to endure. She held the truth the way she held everything else, quietly, steadily, and without letting it show. In South Carolina, 1838, knowledge did not grant safety. More often, it narrowed the ground beneath one's feet. The girl who never cried understood this instinctively once the truth about her parentage settled into her awareness. What she knew did not raise her above her circumstances. It made her more visible in ways she could not afford. And so she made a deliberate choice. Not to speak, not to confront, not to test the fragile limits of what others allowed her to know. She chose stillness. This stillness was not the same as before. Earlier, her silence had been instinctive, shaped by observation and habit. Now it became purposeful. She learned to govern her expressions more carefully, to let nothing slip that might suggest she understood more than she was meant to. Knowledge, she realized, had a sound. It altered posture, sharpened the eyes, changed the way questions formed. She worked to quiet those signs. She stopped lingering near the house unless sent. Where once she had listened for patterns, she now measured distance. Too much presence could invite scrutiny. She adjusted her routine so her work kept her at the edges of notice. Not hidden, but unremarkable. The elders noticed the shift and did not interfere. They recognized strategy when they saw it. Exposure, she understood, did not always come through words. It came through familiarity, through being remembered, through being spoken of when absent. So she cultivated forgettability. She moved at a steady pace, neither eager nor slow. She avoided drawing praise, Knowing praise often preceded attention, and attention could turn without warning. At the same time, she did not retreat entirely. Disappearance carried its own dangers. A person who vanished from view could be miscounted, misplaced, or accused. Instead, she balanced herself carefully, present enough to be accounted for, distant enough to avoid curiosity. There were moments when speech tempted her, when she overheard a lie spoken about her mother, when a careless remark brushed close to the truth she carried. Each time, she measured the cost of correction. She understood that truth, when spoken by someone without power, could be turned into accusation. Silence, in those moments, preserved her position. Her restraint did not go unnoticed by everyone. Some mistook it for obedience. Others, particularly the overseer, regarded her with narrowed eyes, as though sensing something withheld. She responded by becoming predictable. Predictability dulled suspicion. She followed instructions exactly, never anticipating or improvising. What she did was what was asked. No more, no less. The elders reinforced her choice through quiet reminders. One passed her a bowl and murmured, "Don't carry what ain't yours to carry yet." Another said, "Some doors open better if you don't push." These were not warnings meant to frighten her. They were confirmations that stillness could be a form of protection. Inside herself, the work was harder. Knowledge pressed outward, seeking release. She felt it in moments of fatigue, when restraint loosened and her thoughts ran ahead of her body. She learned then to redirect herself, counting breaths, repeating tasks in her mind, grounding herself in movement. Stillness, she discovered, required discipline. She also learned to observe her own reactions as carefully as she observed others. When anger stirred, she noted it without acting. When sorrow threatened to rise into her throat, she swallowed it down, not in denial but in postponement. There would be a time, she told herself, when feeling could be afforded. This was not it. Her choice to remain still altered how others interacted with her. Conversations around her grew less guarded, not more. Believing her unaffected, people spoke freely in her presence. This reinforced her decision. Exposure would have closed those doors. Silence kept them ajar. Yet stillness did not mean passivity. She continued to store information, but selectively. Not everything was worth remembering. She learned to distinguish between noise and signal, between cruelty that was routine and cruelty that carried consequence. This discernment became another layer of protection. At night, when she lay awake, she reflected on the narrowness of her path. One misstep, a word spoken too clearly, a look held too long, could undo what she had preserved. This awareness did not frighten her into paralysis. It sharpened her attention. She learned that survival sometimes required the refusal to act, even when action seemed justified. The knowledge of her parentage could have tempted her toward confrontation or hope. She chose neither. Hope, when unsupported, could become exposure. Confrontation could become punishment. Stillness allowed her to remain in control of what little she could control, her own behavior. By choosing stillness over exposure, the girl asserted a quiet authority over her life. She could not change the structures that confined her, but she could decide how much of herself they accessed. This choice preserved not only her safety, but her sense of self. She remained intact. In South Carolina, 1838, such a choice was not weakness. It was strategy shaped by necessity. The girl who never cried understood that survival was not always about enduring pain. Sometimes it was about refusing to reveal where one could be wounded. In South Carolina, 1838, endurance was not proven through grand trials or open defiance. It was tested in proximity, in the quiet narrowing of space, where avoidance was no longer possible and silence had to hold its shape under pressure. For the girl who never cried, that test arrived not as a single moment, but as a gradual tightening of circumstances that drew her closer to the source of the truth she carried. The change began with a reassignment. She was told, without explanation, that her work would shift closer to the main house. The instruction was delivered casually, as though it meant nothing. Yet she felt the weight of it immediately. Distance had been her protection. Proximity threatened it. Still, she did not object. Objection would have drawn attention, and attention was what she had learned to avoid. Her new tasks were modest on their face, carrying trays, tending to fires, waiting quietly while others spoke. They placed her in rooms where voices softened when she entered, then loosened again when she remained still. She became part of the background of domestic life, her presence tolerated, sometimes forgotten. This forgetfulness was dangerous. It invited carelessness. She soon found herself in the presence of the man whose blood she shared, but whose name she could not claim. He did not acknowledge her directly. His gaze slid past her, as though she were no different from the furniture she dusted. And yet, she felt the pull of his attention in subtler ways. The way his voice tightened when others spoke of the past. The way his temper flared more quickly in her presence, then retreated. The test lay not in what he did, but in how close she was forced to stand to what she knew. Each encounter required discipline. She kept her eyes lowered, her movements precise. She measured her breath, careful not to betray recognition or expectation. Recognition could invite consequence. Expectation could invite disappointment. She allowed neither. There were moments when the pressure nearly broke her composure. Once, she was asked to stand nearby while a conversation unfolded that circled dangerously close to her existence. Her name was not spoken, but she was referred to indirectly as that one, as a reminder. She felt the words strike her like heat, testing whether she would flinch. She did not. Inside, however, the effort was immense. Her endurance was no longer passive. It required constant adjustment, a vigilance that left her exhausted by day's end. At night, she lay awake, replaying every glance, every inflection, searching for signs she had misstepped. The absence of punishment did not reassure her. It sharpened her awareness of how close she stood to it. The elders noticed the toll. One evening, as they worked side by side, an older woman pressed her shoulder gently, a rare gesture of comfort. "You're walking a narrow board," she murmured, "but you're still on it." The words steadied the girl more than any promise could have. The endurance being tested was not only her ability to remain silent, but her ability to endure ambiguity. She was close enough to imagine what might have been said if the world were different, but far enough to know those words would never be offered. This tension threatened to erode her from within. Yet she adapted. She learned to treat proximity as another environment to be navigated. Just as she had learned the rhythms of field and quarters, she learned the rhythms of the house. When to speak if spoken to, when to pause, when to withdraw. She learned that endurance sometimes meant knowing when to leave a room without appearing to flee. The man at the center of her truth tested her endurance without knowing it. His avoidance, his occasional sharpness, his silence. These were pressures applied without intent, yet they pressed nonetheless. She bore them without reaction, understanding that any visible response would become part of his reckoning, not hers. There came a moment, quiet, easily missed, when endurance nearly gave way to exposure. She was asked a simple question, one that brushed against memory and recognition. The answer she offered was careful, truthful without being revealing. It passed. The moment closed. The test continued. What sustained her was not hope of acknowledgement, but commitment to survival. She understood now that endurance was not about waiting for justice or relief. It was about preserving herself intact in the face of circumstances that sought to define her without her consent. By remaining composed under proximity, she proved, to herself more than anyone, that her silence was not brittle. It could bend without breaking. The test did not free her. It refined her. In South Carolina, 1838, such endurance was invisible to those who benefited from her restraint, but it was real. And it carried her forward, steady step by steady step, across ground that offered no forgiveness for missteps. In South Carolina, 1838, power did not always announce itself through command or violence. Sometimes it took the form of memory, restraint, and the careful use of what others assumed would never be used at all. For the girl who never cried, leverage did not come from confrontation or exposure. It came from knowing what to do, and what not to do, with what she carried. By now, she understood something most adults around her refused to admit. People behaved differently when they believed they were being remembered. Even those who held authority relied on forgetting, on the assumption that words spoken in private would dissolve into air, that small acts would leave no record. The girl's leverage lay in her refusal to forget. She never wrote anything down. Writing was dangerous, and she had no access to it anyway. Instead, she organized her memory deliberately. Faces were tied to voices. Promises were tied to dates marked by weather or harvest. Tone mattered as much as words. She remembered who spoke kindly only when others listened, and who spoke plainly when no one watched. This internal ledger grew quietly, never shared, never shown. The leverage she gained was subtle. She did not threaten. She did not hint. She simply behaved in ways that unsettled those who preferred to believe she was unaware. Once, an overseer accused her of neglecting a task she had completed exactly as instructed. She did not protest loudly. She repeated his earlier words back to him, calmly, accurately, without emphasis. The precision of her memory startled him. His anger faltered, replaced by something like caution. He dismissed her quickly, and the accusation did not return. Another time, a household woman spoke sharply to her, then softened suddenly, as though remembering something. The girl responded with the same neutral tone she used with everyone, but her eyes lingered a fraction longer than necessary. It was not defiance. It was acknowledgement. The woman's voice changed after that. Never kind, but measured. These moments were small. They did not alter the structure of her life, but they shifted how others approached her. People became more careful in her presence, not because she demanded respect, but because she inspired uncertainty. Uncertainty could slow cruelty, the elders noticed. One remarked quietly, "They don't rush you like they used to." Another said, "They mind their mouths some now." These observations were offered without praise. Praise could draw attention. Instead, they offered recognition. The girl understood that leverage worked best when it remained invisible. The moment it was named, it could be stripped away. So she used it sparingly, only when necessary, only to correct a path that threatened to turn dangerous. She learned when to remind someone, gently, that she remembered a kindness. Gratitude, offered at the right time, could bind a person more securely than fear. She also learned when to remind someone, indirectly, that she remembered a slight. Not through accusation, but through presence. Through calm endurance that refused to erase what had been done. This balance required constant judgment. Use too much, and she would be noticed. Use too little, and she would be trampled. She navigated this tension the way she navigated everything else. By watching first. Her leverage extended beyond individuals. She understood routines, dependencies, small systems of habit. She knew which tasks, if delayed, would create inconvenience. Which tasks, if done quietly and well, would be missed only when absent. This knowledge allowed her to position herself where her labor was useful enough to be valued, but not so central as to be scrutinized. At times, she used her silence itself as leverage. When asked a careless question, She paused before answering, allowing the weight of the pause to settle. People often filled silence with their own words. In doing so, they revealed more than they intended. She listened, and the ledger grew. There was no triumph in this, no satisfaction. Leverage was not revenge. It was maintenance. It kept her days from becoming harsher than they already were. It preserved a margin of safety in a world that offered none freely. She also understood the limits of what she held. Memory could not free her. Observation could not undo bondage. But they could shape how she moved within it. They could reduce harm. They could buy time. The most important part of her leverage was restraint. She resisted the temptation to reveal what she knew, even when doing so might have felt justified. Revelation would have shifted control away from her. As long as her knowledge remained hers alone, she retained agency over it. In South Carolina, 1838, such agency was rare and fragile. The girl who never cried protected it fiercely. Not through force, but through discipline. Her quiet leverage did not change the world around her, but it changed how the world touched her. And in a life defined by constraint, that difference mattered. In South Carolina, 1838, the girl's silence had followed her long enough that others believed they understood it. They thought it meant she felt less, that she had been emptied early by hardship, that whatever should have broken her had already done its work. These assumptions settled around her like dust, unnoticed and unchallenged. She did nothing to brush them away. What no one saw was how carefully her silence had been shaped. By the time she reached her later years of childhood, not crying had become more than a habit. It was a boundary. Tears, she had learned, were invitations, to pity, to scrutiny, to control. They drew attention to wounds others believed they had the right to examine. Silence, by contrast, kept ownership where it belonged. Her feelings remained hers. She still felt pain. The ache of long days, the quiet grief of knowing what she could never claim, the weight of watching others suffer without the power to intervene. These things lived inside her as surely as breath, but she did not release them into the open. She carried them inward, arranging them carefully so they did not spill. The elders understood this. They never asked her why she did not cry. They had learned that endurance expressed itself differently in different bodies. Some survived by singing, some by praying aloud, some by speaking back, even when it cost them. The girl survived by remembering. Memory became her true inheritance. She remembered names spoken carelessly and promises made without intention of keeping them. She remembered kindness offered quietly and cruelty delivered with politeness. She remembered who turned away and who lingered. These memories were not weapons. They were anchors. They kept her sense of self from drifting away. As time passed, people stopped waiting for her to break. The overseer's glances slid past her. The household voices grew accustomed to her presence. She became part of the background of their lives. Reliable, unremarkable, contained. This containment was what they valued. It reassured them. What they did not see was how intact she remained beneath it. She did not dream aloud of freedom or justice. Such dreams, when spoken, could invite despair. Instead, she focused on survival measured in days rather than destinies. She learned to notice small mercies without trusting them. She learned to accept restraint without mistaking it for safety. She learned that her life would be shaped not by recognition, but by persistence. There were moments, rare and fleeting, when tears threatened her composure. Once, when a younger child cried in the night and no one came. Once, when an elder passed away quietly, her lessons ending without farewell. In those moments, the girl pressed her hands together and breathed until the feeling settled back into its place. Not because she believed crying was wrong, but because she understood what it would cost her. Her silence was often mistaken for absence, but she was present in ways that mattered. She remembered stories others forgot. She carried names forward when mouths closed around them. She became a living record in a place determined to erase its own truths. As she grew older, the meaning of her silence deepened. It was no longer simply a response to fear or caution. It became a choice, a refusal to let suffering define her outwardly. She would not perform pain for those who caused it. She would not make her endurance legible to anyone who had not earned it. In this way, not crying became an act of preservation. It kept her from being consumed by a world that demanded too much and offered too little. It allowed her to remain herself in spaces designed to strip that away. She did not know what her future would hold. She did not imagine it clearly. The world around her offered few examples worth imagining, but she knew she would carry herself forward with the same discipline she had learned as a child, with watchfulness, restraint, and memory. Years later, people would still speak of her quietly. The girl who never cried. Some would say it with unease, others with curiosity. None would understand what it had cost her to remain silent. And that was as it should be. Because her silence was not emptiness. It was shelter. It was witness. It was survival carried inward, steady and unyielding, in a time and place where survival itself was an achievement never meant to be acknowledged.